HCGChica. So this is the start of a 3-part series on how to do phase 3 of the HCG diet. And basically the videos, what they're going to cover is 3 different ways to do phase 3. There's basically 3 choices. There's the doable way, there's the best way, and there's the not gonna work way. So this particular video, we're gonna talk about the doable way to do phase 3. And it's basically what the title says. It's a doable way that the vast majority of us will be able to handle. The second video, which will cover the best way to do phase 3, involves more details, more rules that some of us may not be mentally ready to handle. And that's okay, but for those of you who are ready to handle that, it could prove to be the smartest, the smoothest way to do phase 3. You'll run into less trouble if you can do it that way, and so that's why I'm calling it the best way. And then the last one, of course, is the not gonna work way, and we want to talk about that too, because it's important to talk about what doesn't work and why it doesn't work, because that will help us to avoid doing that. So I followed this doable method for phase 3 for all of my rounds. I feel like I may have made enough changes to my eating and my relationship with food to attempt the best way that we'll talk about in the next video for phase 3 if I ever did another round. But I don't have one in the foreseeable future though. But anyway, so doing phase 3 this way did work for me. I did experience some major indigestion. I did get overly full. I did have to make corrections because I, wasn't perfect about it. So that's why I'm calling it the doable way and not the best way, because it's just not the best way. But the truth is, we're just not all in a place where we're ready to be perfectly strict about some things. And in the end, even though my P3s were a little rocky at times, I'm still, I'm here a year and a half after my last round, and I've been maintaining all my weight loss. So just to show you guys that, P3 can be simple. You don't have to be so scared or have to do everything exactly a certain way or you'll totally fail. That's kind of the intent of this article, is to show you a doable way to do it that can work for many, and just knowing that you may have to make some corrections here and there, but it's a little more straightforward and a little simplified, and it can work. Now, this is not to be confused with actually cheating on phase 3, okay? So this slightly more laid back approach to phase 3 is not the same as cheating on phase 3. The one thing that I did always do without fail on phase 3 was no starches, no sugars, no cheating. Very strict. You do have to go by that. It's just essential to actually stabilizing your weight, and that I did follow that for all my phase 3s. But really, this can sound really vague, right? No starches, no sugars. What exactly does that mean? And so we'll talk a little bit about details of what I would consider anyway to be a starch or a sugar for phase 3 purposes, so that you can know, exactly what to avoid. So here's some of the questions that come up for phase 3. Does no sugar include no fruits? How many calories should I be eating? What exactly does no starch mean anyway? Do I just increase the amounts of P2 foods during P3, as some sites say? Should I do a steak day before I reach the 2-pound limit because I'm getting nervous? How does dairy and nuts fit into all this? Oh my goodness, I gained 1 pound. Was it the pickles or, the no sugar almond flour cookies I ate? So we're gonna talk about stuff like that. So I think if you follow some of the advice in this video, your P3 should go more smoothly. It should be less emotionally nerve-wracking, and you should stabilize out more quickly. For some of you out there though, I do wanna mention that you may have to follow the advice in my the best way to do phase 3 video, which I will link to in this article. Just because in some cases, whether it's your metabolism being messed up from the past, or maybe you're in menopause, unfortunately age, especially for women, has something to do with our ability to lose and maintain weight. I hate that that's true, but it is. And so due to those factors, this video and doing it the doable way, slightly more laid back, it may not work for you to stabilize. You know, and in that case, you may have to follow a more detailed route. So I just want to make sure I mention that too. So I'm going to be detailing out a lot of information here, and like I said, I don't want you guys to get overwhelmed. You don't necessarily have to know how many carbs are in a half cup of raspberries. Even though I may be providing some information to you guys like that, that's not necessarily something you have to know. You don't have to scrutinize every single thing you put in your mouth. You know, and the reason I'm saying this is because if it were me and it was my first P3, and I was watching this and seeing like all these details about how many carbs are in every food and calories and all that, I mean, I'd probably get really overwhelmed. So, you know, I'm providing this just to help you guys have examples just to see. But I didn't spend my P3s counting carbs in berries and stuff like that, okay? So I just want to make that part clear. If you're too overwhelmed to think about all the details, just remember two things. No starches, no sugars, and if in doubt, leave it out, okay? So all this other stuff I'm going to go through, I think it's useful if you're ready for it, but if that makes you discouraged or freaked out, just go by those two basic rules: no starches, no sugars, which I will detail out in a minute what exactly I think that should probably entail. And if in doubt, leave it out. Sometimes there's a question where you're not sure, like, would this be considered a starch and sugar? If you're not sure, just leave it out. Remember, this is only for a few weeks. While you stabilize, you will be able to incorporate a lot of other things in the very near future. Okay, so let's get started with the doable way for phase 3. I want to talk for a minute about the craziness to expect in phase 3. So you know that like 2-pound gain you had from like your little cheat on a small piece of chocolate in phase 2? That kind of craziness. So that kind of craziness hasn't ended with the start of phase 3. You can experience very similar crazy things like that in phase 3. There's basically 3 things to expect in phase 3. Expect your weight to be volatile. It may bounce around quite a bit. This is totally normal. Just expect it. It will definitely start to settle out as time wears on. Usually in the second week of P3, you'll start to notice it kind of stabilizing out. Okay, so that's to be expected. Expect scale jumps if you eat non-P3 approved foods. So do expect that. You can gain fat back more quickly during phase 3 than later once you're more stabilized. So again, this is why we need to take P3 seriously, because that can totally happen, and it just sucks, you know, to have to, like, all of that time you spent on P2, you can undo it so quickly if you don't kind of go by some of these basic rules. So expect that can easily happen. The third thing is expect to not be able to eat certain things in phase 3 that you most likely will be able to eat later. So you may find, you know, oftentimes it's dairy and nuts. You may find that those cause you gains. Don't let that totally freak you out and make you think that, oh my gosh, I can't eat like most foods now forever. That's not how it's going to be. Phase 3 really is different. What you can't eat in phase 3, very likely you will be able to have later, okay? So just keep those 3 things in mind about the craziness that you can expect during phase 3. Okay, so here are the 4 basic rules for a doable phase 3. This is so that you don't fall into that, you know, not gonna work way phase 3. So the 4 basic rules are: 1, for 3 weeks following phase 2, don't eat any starches or sugars. 2, keep your weight within 2 pounds of your LDW. Now I have a little asterisk on the article at this point because there are cases where you're going to have to totally ignore that rule. And there's a whole separate video and blog post about that, and I will link to it. 3, if your weight goes above the 2-pound rule, then you would do a steak day. And 4, if your weight goes above the 2-pound window and you have to do a steak day, technically you would start the phase 3 period all over again. So we'll talk about that in a minute too. Okay, so a quick serious pep talk about phase 3. It's so important to take phase 3 seriously. It really doesn't pay to be careless about this part of the protocol. I mean, you kind of want to be merciless with what you don't allow on phase 3. Your options in phase 3 are definitely a lot more than what you had in phase 2. So, enjoy the variety while still being cognizant of what phase 3 is for, what the purpose is, and why it's so important. And if you're not sure about that, I will link to my series of articles that talk all about the purpose of phase 3. So all too often, we feel like the diet part of this protocol, where we're being very aware of what we're eating and we're very present with the whole process, we often tend to feel like that ends at phase 2. But in actuality, we have to maintain that same presence of mind through phase 3 as well. Otherwise, that weight loss, those efforts will easily be lost. Often by the end of P2, we're getting really tired of all the restrictions that are a part of phase 2, and that's totally fine. That's normal. I remember feeling that way. But that's why it's good to shift our focus and our goals while we're in phase 3. Basically, what you want to do is not stop having goals. You had your goal during phase 2 to lose weight, you were focused on that. Now with phase 3, you don't want the goal setting to just stop. You want to shift your goals, you want to shift your mindset to something new. And for phase 3, a nourishing, healing, strengthening of your body, that is really a good goal set to have for phase 3. Okay, so finally, we're at the P3 rules breakdown. So we're gonna go over the 4 rules that I just talked about for this doable way for phase 3. So what does no sugar, no starches mean? Basically, there's sugars and starches obviously anything with actual sugar in it, but that would also include grains, beans or legumes, fruit, and starchy vegetables. So we'll talk about that in a little detail now. And remember, again, if in doubt, leave it out. You'll really be glad that you did that later. I'm going to look down at my notes for a little bit because I wrote out some stuff. We all have different perspectives on foods, and sometimes it can be confusing, like what really is considered a carb or a starch. And I've gotten a lot of interesting questions from you guys about specific things that I would have not realized that someone wasn't sure, if it was a sugar or a starch. So these are the things that in my mind are definitely out for following that rule. All grains. So for me, that would be wheat, couscous, rice, even brown rice, barley, corn, tortillas, chips, quinoa. It doesn't matter if it's sprouted. For example, Ezekiel bread. This has 11 to 12 grams of net carbs per slice still. So to me, that's still probably too high for P3. The thing is we can't think about food from other perspectives. There's definitely a lot of foods that are healthy and that would be great for a healthy way of living. Like sprouted grains are definitely healthier. But in P3, they still have a high amount of carbs. So for P3, probably is not going to work for most of us. Next is starchy vegetables. So things like potatoes, sweet potatoes, yams, peas. Those root vegetable chips. Again, in regular life, you might be thinking like, oh, root vegetable chips are healthier than potato chips or whatever, but they're still high in carbs. So again, just still avoid that in P3. Moving on to fruits. Now, people debate about whether or not fruits are considered, in that boat with the no sugar, no starch. To me, I think that it would be included. Many fruits are very high in natural fructose sugar. The one thing I will say about this, though, is that with berries, like strawberries, blueberries, blackberries, raspberries, those are fairly low carb. They're like a low sugar fruit. And so if you do choose to have a little fruit on P3, like I've done P3 smoothies and stuff like that, and I'd put like a half cup of blueberries, frozen blueberries. So those are a good choice. But I do think it's probably in the best interest of most people to avoid all the other fruits. Even grapefruit and apple, stuff like that. Even though those were a part of P2, P3 is actually a little different. Grapefruit and apples, they're actually fairly high sugar, high carb fruits. Same thing like with bananas and pineapple and mangoes, all that kind of stuff. So that's the kind of stuff you probably want to save for P4. But again, if you want to have like some berries, small amounts of berries, that would probably be low carb enough to be able to have. beans, frijoles, whatever you want to call them. Probably best to leave beans out. Yeah, definitely. If you look up the carbs, it's definitely a lot of carbs. Then there's these hidden carbs that I want to talk about real briefly, and that's in the form of milk and nuts, just as examples. Even though dairy and nuts are technically, allowed on phase 3, just to give you some perspective, 1 cup of milk actually has 12 grams of carbs or sugars, 12 grams of sugar. It doesn't mean you can't have dairy, but it just means you want to be aware of the type of dairy you're having, and just check like the nutrition label, and find out like what's in it. Same thing with nuts. There's actually 20 grams of carbs in 1 cup of almonds. And again, most people aren't going to eat a whole cup of almonds, so if you're only having a small amount, it's probably fine. But it's just good to keep it in mind because, a lot of us these days are baking with things like almond flour as an alternative baked good, which is a totally great choice. It's just that if you're eating like a lot of it and it's right at the start of phase 3, you could run into trouble. And I'm trying to help lay these things out there because it's at those points when you like see a gain on the scale and it's day 3 of P3 and you're like, you feel like you're doing everything right and you're like, what did I do wrong? I'm totally following the rules. These are the types of little hidden carbs that you might be running into. Because there's some flaxseed almond flour cookies. I have a recipe actually on my website for them, and they're so good that I would eat most of the cookies that I'd make in one sitting. They're just so good, and even though they're technically low carb, since there's so much almond flour in it, if you eat too many of them, then it ends up being not low carb. So those are just things to be aware of. Again, you don't have to scrutinize every single detail, but just kind of check in as you go through things. Just check, because sometimes you can be surprised at sugars or carbs being in things that you wouldn't have thought. So what if you aren't sure if something is a starch or a carb still? I kind of already mentioned this, but basically just always check the ingredients and the nutrition label of whatever you're looking at. Labeling can be really deceiving. Like, sometimes on boxes of stuff you'll see like all natural or organic or sprouted grain or whatever the case may be. But that kind of labeling can be deceptive, and you don't really know what that means half the time. So when you actually look at the ingredients and the nutrition label, that is where you can really quickly find out if it's acceptable for P3. Ingredients, if you see stuff like maltodextrin, things like that, that's technically a starch. Those can be those hidden starches that in phase 4 aren't going to affect you, but in phase 3 they could. And so it's good to be cautious with that. And also with the nutrition label, that makes it nice and easy because it tells you, carbs, 10 grams, or sugars. And always check the serving size too. Sometimes you have like sodas and it's saying, oh, it's only 10 grams of sugar, and then there's 4 servings, It's like, oh, wait a minute, the whole thing is actually 40 grams of sugar. So, check stuff like that so that you're aware of, about how much you're getting of certain things. So as you can see, you won't just be eating more P2 foods in P3. I do hear that talked about a lot. I don't necessarily think, it's wrong or anything, except for the fruit aspect. I find most people are not going to tolerate fruits well, except for those berries and stuff. So be cautious about that. But I really don't think you need to only eat P2 foods in P3. There's a lot of other variety of foods that I feel that you should be able to start incorporating in phase 3. But again, the amount, how much you eat is something to be more aware of. Let's talk next about what is your LDW or your LIW, because this is important for knowing what weight are you actually trying to maintain. So LIW stands for last injection weight, and LDW stands for last dose weight. The reason that there's 2 terms is because not everyone does injections, so last injection weight wouldn't apply to the people doing drops. So your last injection weight is the weight that you are on the scale the morning of your last injection. So if it's Tuesday morning and it's the day you're going to inject that day, it's your last day to inject, that number on the scale is your LIW, and that's the weight that you're going to be trying to stay within 2 pounds of. For last dose weight, you know, I'm not actually an HCG drops girl, so I was thinking about this, like, wait, I'm not actually sure I know the answer. I believe your last dose weight would be your weight on the scale that last day of drops that you're taking. So again, it would be the same day. If it was a Tuesday morning and it's your last day of drops, that should be your last dose weight. So correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that that is the accurate way to look at that. Now, what your LDW and LIW are not, that's important to get to, because it can be confusing. I mean, there's all these different parts to this protocol. So, you know how there's that 72 hours after your last dose of HCG that you're supposed to continue the 500 calorie diet, right? So the first day of P3, you know, is after that 72 hours. So that is not your LDW. Like whatever weight you are on you know, the first day of P3, that's not your LIW, that's not the weight you're trying to maintain. And the reason that this is important is because most likely from your actual last dose weight to the first day of P3, you know, 72 hours later, you will probably lose more weight. In fact, you should probably lose more weight. So you will be lower when you start P3 than your LIW. And it's important to note that because some people try to maintain that really lower weight, and as Dr. Simeons had mentioned, it's very difficult to maintain that weight loss because some of that was lost while the HCG was kind of almost out of your system. And I have found that to be true, and many others have as well. So you don't want to get stuck in like this rut of trying to maintain a weight that's actually too low, and you'll find yourself not being able to do it. So that's why it's important to, you know, make sure you guys know the difference between those two things. I want to give you guys a quick example to show you what I mean. So say it's a Saturday and it's the morning of, you know, somebody's last injection and they're 156 pounds. That would be their LIW. Now say it's Tuesday, which is now the first day of P3, and they are now 153 pounds. So their LIW is 156. A few days later at the start of P3, they're actually 153. So they've actually lost 3 more pounds between their LIW to P3. So in phase 3, they would be attempting to stay within 2 pounds of 156. That was their LIW. So even though they're starting out at 153 in P3, really they only need to stay, you know, somewhere between 156 and 158. So in this case, the person is actually starting out with a 5-pound window, not a 2-pound window. Does that make sense? Maybe I should like show a picture to you guys or something. But anyway, so she would only do a stake day if she reached 158 pounds. So you can see where that's different. If the person had thought their LIW was at the start of P3 and they're 153 pounds, they would be hitting 155 and feeling like, oh my gosh, I have to do a stake day, where technically they're actually still under their LDW at 155. So I hope that wasn't too confusing. And again, the reason I'm actually mentioning it is because when you try to stick to this weight that's actually lower than your actual LDW, you can find yourself like doing stake day after stake day, and it can just turn into this big mess because your body just doesn't want to stay there. So yeah. Now some people do end up stabilizing lower than their LDW, and that's totally fine, of course, you know. It's just that you don't want to get stuck on that, like be set on that, because I feel like you can run into a lot of frustrations if you do, whereas maybe just a couple pounds up, it would have been so easy and no emotional trauma and all that stuff. So that's, you know, just keep that in mind. But some people do stabilize lower, and I think that's perfectly fine too. I mean, the point really is just that you stabilize. You know, where that's at doesn't matter, you know. I mean, if it's 20 pounds higher, that's probably not ideal, but you know, somewhere within a few pounds, wherever that's at, if you get stable, I mean, you've achieved your goal. Okay, let's talk about the third rule, which is stake days, doing a stake day. So technically, say we're back to that lady whose LDW is 156 pounds, right? So if she were to get up to 158 pounds one morning, the idea is that she would immediately do a stake day that day. And what that involves is basically fasting all day long and drinking lots of water. So not eating any food, just fasting, drinking water. And then for dinner, you would have a large steak and a tomato or apple. And that would be your dinner, and then that's it. And then usually what happens is the following morning, whatever gain you had will go away. So sometimes you'll lose like, 1 to 2 or 3 or even 4 pounds at times. A lot of this is often water retention, but it does seem like during this phase, with weight being so volatile, you can quickly correct even fat gains while you're in this, which is why it's a good idea to do those steak days in order to really help rein your body in and start making things even out. One of the things that a steak day accomplishes is it creates a calorie balance. So usually, if you have a gain from P3 during P3, and there's other factors like water retention and too much sodium, or if you're exercising on HCG, you can gain weight. And I have a whole article that talks all about, gaining weight on P3 and what some of the causes can be. So I'll link to that in this article. But just as far as, a true gain is usually going to be from eating too much, right? Too much calories or too much fat or whatever for this part of the phase. And so what you're doing is when you're fasting the following day, you're creating a calorie balance over those days. It's kind of counteracting what you overdid the previous day. Additionally, by having the large-sized steak, protein is supposed to be really good for helping your body get rid of water retention. And I thought it's pretty interesting to note that in Dr. Simeon's protocol, and it really does seem to work well when you have a steak day, it's not like you fast and then eat, a tiny piece of steak. He said have a good sized steak. I can't remember how he words it, but yeah, have a large steak. And that's what I would do. I'd have a large steak. And other people that I've interviewed, they would eat like a large steak, and then they would have a very large loss the next day. So I kind of think that's interesting. So that's a steak day. So to me, the steak days kind of give you a measure of control over your body during this kind of volatile time, and helps you kind of force your body back to where you want it to go until it starts getting comfortable there. Last thing I want to note about this with the steak days, though, is there really are some extenuating circumstances that come into play when stabilizing in a 2-pound window. And again, I'm going to link to the article and video that talks all about when to throw the 2-pound rule window, or the 2-pound rule out the window, because there definitely are cases where you're going to have to do that. I've had to do that, and it's important to know about these factors, because if you don't, you're just gonna have so much trouble, and you're probably gonna give up at some point because your body just won't cooperate. But there's some very good reasons for that, and that's why if we know them, we can work with our body. Okay, let's talk about the last rule, which is starting phase 3 over if you've had to do a steak day. Okay, I could have sworn that I read about this in pounds and inches. I could have sworn that I read this, but now I can't find it anywhere in there. So regardless, I'm still going to keep it in here, and I want to give you an example for why I think that this is an appropriate thing to do. So think about it like this. Say you're in a scenario where you're 2 weeks into phase 3, but your weight has been really fluctuating a lot. Perhaps you were discovering you're kind of sensitive to certain foods, or maybe you were just eating too much and then you were realizing it and then correcting it with steak days and etc., right? And now you're a couple weeks into phase 3, but your weight has never really stayed in any general spot for any length of time yet because of all these issues that you've been having. If you think about it, does it make sense, like even if you get to the end of phase 3 and maybe your weight's only been around the same weight for like 4 days, but now it's technically time to start phase 4, does it seem like a good idea to start phase 4 and to start adding sugars and starches, when in reality, your weight has actually only been in a stable range for like 4 or 5 days? So do you see what I'm saying? This is why I'm thinking that it's a good idea to start phase 3 over, because the idea is to find a weight that you are actually stable at for a period of time so that your body doesn't move from it easily. And if you've spent the first couple weeks of phase 3 kind of, bouncing all over the place, and it may not be your fault, or you're just learning from your mistakes or whatever the case may be, but if that has happened, to me it makes logical sense to continue phase 3 longer until you really do see that window of time for a few weeks where your weight is pretty stable. Because once you get to that point, that's when you start to know, like, okay, my body's happy here, and I can, maybe try adding some other stuff in. So I feel like that is a good thing to keep in mind, because it's just basically you haven't stabilized if your weight's still bouncing around all the place. It doesn't matter if you're at the end of the technical P3 period. If your weight's still bouncing all over, you're not stabilized right yet. So what's important is in those cases, you can think it's unfair, you can think whatever you want, but in the end, what is it that you want? You want to be stable so that you can move forward and eat other things, and whatever it takes for your body to do that, you want to try to work with that. Okay, so as a quick recap, remember, if you are mentally overwhelmed by all of this, just remember 2 basic rules. No starches, no sugars, which I detailed out in the article what those would be. And if in doubt, leave it out. So just remember those 2 things. If you can handle a little more, we covered 4 basic rules for a doable phase 3. The first one was, of course, no starches, no sugars. 2, keeping your weight within a 2-pound limit or range of your LIW or LDW. 3, doing a steak day if you go over the 2-pound limit. And 4, starting phase 3 over if you find that you are having to do a steak day. So anyway, I hope that was helpful. That was a mouthful. Even when I'm detailing all this out, I just worry about it seeming overwhelming. I didn't have all of this information when I was doing P3, but anything that we can have to make phase 3 less rocky, I think, is a good thing. And again, it will start smoothing out. I promise. That first week is especially scary, but you will see it start to stabilize out. And if you'll stay tuned, I will have my next article, which is all about doing phase 3 the best way, in my mind, which involves more rules, not just 4 rules. I think there's more like 6 rules or something like that. And it's just a more detailed approach to phase 3, a more reserved approach. And in general, the people who do it this way, and I'm not one of them, I've never been mature enough to do a phase 3 this way. Like I said, maybe if I had a future round, I could do it this way now, but none of my P3s before were done this way. But those who have taken this more detailed approach really seem to have very smooth P3s. And there's really an advantage to that because, nobody wants to be terrified and emotionally distraught over what's going on with the scale, and that really does seem to help avoid that. So anyway, stay tuned for that. And anyway, you can find me on Facebook, HCGChica, Instagram, HCGChica, and of course my blog, hcgchica.com, where I have tons of awesome free helpful advice for the protocol. And anyway, that's it. Okay, take care. Bye.